Welcome back, campers. Today we're talking about imagination in our series on mindset. Yes. How we imagine our reality into being.
And why do we want to talk about imagination when we talk about mindset?
Yeah, it's the creative element in mindset. Without it, there is no creativity. Then we have to fall back on logic. And our great professor.
Ancestor.
I was going to say Einstein.
Our wise spiritual guru.
Yeah, he's like Yoda.
Yeah.
He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. That's Einstein.
Wow.
We know he did a lot of his work through what is called thought experiments. So he would actually run the movie backward and forward in his mind instead of having to do an actual experiment in the laboratory or on the math board. He would imagine what would happen if I was in an elevator or a person was in an elevator and the elevator was dropped. Right? The person inside would essentially be floating, feel like they're floating, meaning they're not glued to the floor because they're in free fall. But from their perspective, it would appear that, I'm weightless.
And they would be weightless at that point, right?
They would be, or that's the experience of weightlessness, that it's a falling, and that's how he figured out gravity. that it's a different phenomena than a magnet, let's say.
And then also, like, as opposed to the traditional scientific experiments where you're moving objects and measuring them, like a Newtonian kind of like the apple falling from the tree. I also heard that he came up with the theory of relativity by imagining himself riding a light beam through, and he came up with this idea of time-space from that. And so I mean, even the most talented, knowledgeable person was able to use imagination. Another person who used imagination is Thomas Edison. Every time he would, try to get the incandescent bulb. Of course, it took 1,000 times, but he would meditate. He would lay on his little couch in his little office and his little experiment room, and he would imagine like a different way to do it. And then he would go ahead and perform the experiment. And if it didn't work, he would like kind of think through it himself. And I think people, when we're kids, we're not taught to value that imagination, and we're natural imaginers. I mean, we can get a box, a cardboard box, and make it a fort, and have like all these stories and play so wonderfully. We get these little dolls and these little figures, and we're creating these like things. And then when we go to school, they take that away from us in a way. They take that, they say, remember these facts, remember history, learn how to do math. And there isn't really a class on imagination, except for maybe art, do an art class or something.
Yeah. Were you a big daydreamer in school?
Oh my God. I was a big chatter. I got in trouble for talking all the time. But I was a big daydreamer as a child. Like I had like an imaginary world, and I would go into my dream state as my imaginary character, and I would like go and have adventures. And then I would tell my friends, and they all thought I was kind of crazy. Like, what are you doing? Like, oh yeah. Then I was friends with all like the superheroes, and I would have this kind of like imaginary world and be a part of that. And so that kind of gave me this, I think that's why I love visualization when I got into it as a career, because it was like, this is what I do. This is my thing, is like you're creating movies in your mind, and you're creating like a whole screenplay, and you're the central character. So everyone loves to focus on themselves. So how does imagination work as far as the brain?
Yeah, let's break it down.
What is the brain doing with this?
Right. What we know about the brain, and here we're, let's say, isolating the brain as a way of understanding imagination and how we experience it. So what we know about the brain is that we all have a brain.
We do?
Most of us have a brain in our skulls. And this brain is one of the most remarkable organs in the universe, as far as we know. It's about 84 billion neurons and countless other support cells that go into the structure of the brain.
It's like a mini universe in our head.
Yeah, and it's a very complex, a very sophisticated information processing unit, which means it's able to observe the environment through its senses and put that kind of coordinate and synthesize that input that's coming in from the senses into this first person experience that we call my experience, my life, my thoughts, my sense of who I am and my sense of the world. In some circles, this is called qualia. So the qualia is that first person experience that you have when you look at a color, for example. If you see that yellow in your mind, you're experiencing the color yellow. But it's not actually outside.
It's in your mind.
The brain, we're talking about the brain here. The brain is processing the wavelengths of light hitting your retina and giving you that experience of yellow.
So the yellow isn't out there, it's in the brain.
It's
the brain's
in the brain.
Interpretation of the calculations of space and color and light.
Yes. Not only that, that model gives us the model really for all the senses. So if you think about how we experience smells, again, the sensory organs are picking up molecules in the air, analyzing them, and saying, this should smell this way. This should smell like a rose, or this should smell like a fresh cut grass. And then your brain is doing the calculations, the processing, and voila, you have that experience of, oh, this reminds me of when I was a kid, I used to cut the grass. And it's that...
Or the summer day and being outside.
That's the qualia. That we get a first-hand experience of something that is in reality not there.
And so memory stores those experiences, the memory of the brain? Is that what happens? So it takes that yellow, oh, I know that's yellow, and I've given it the label because I learned as a kid that image or that tone or that, I don't know how to describe it, that shade is yellow. And so then it's kind of like automatic, and then we remember it. Yeah,
that's...
and then there's associations with it and all that. So that is the memory in the brain?
Yeah, absolutely. Memory is stored. And what we know about memory in the brain is that it doesn't store like a movie. So a lot of us think, well, I'm kind of experiencing this as a movie. My mind must be recording it and kind of storing it and then just play it back.
Like a DVD.
Right, but that's not really how it does it. There are compartments in the brain, modules, that process information. They specialize in processing certain types of information.
Like so the hearing and seeing, and the sight is back here, and smell is in a different place.
Exactly. There's modules for language, for recalling language, for processing language information, auditory information. And so when we recall something, there are modules for memory recall that they're specialized in scanning all the files and finding those bits and pieces that go with the image that we want to recall. So it'll bring up the image, say, if you recall your mother's face, the structure of the face and that it's your mother that information is stored in one area of the brain, and the color is stored in another place. The sound of her voice is stored in another place. But what the brain does is it brings it all together and presents to us this image of the living person, very much like a movie.
And so if it's stored, repackaging it, basically, it's stored, and then let's put it all back together, where there is some elements that aren't exact, and when they re-put it together may not fit exactly. So there's this other element called our imagination that fills in the details. And
well, that's a good question. Because in essence, so if you think, what is imagination? It is let's say the conceptualizing of, based on that information, and creating that reality or that sense of the image of my mother's face. In essence, that is imagination. In other words, we're imagining
her face.
It's because we're not seeing it, right? We're imagining it.
It's a picture in our mind.
Right.
A lot of people say that I can't visualize, but we always we have this faculty to visualize or to have an image. I think what people say they can't visualize is they expect it to be like that movie. And so when you're visualizing, it is, even in dreams, it's never, you never really see like a full spectrum. It's always this kind of, you're seeing like one step at a time, or like very pockets of experience. Well, even as you recall a dream, it's the same thing. So it's that imagination that's kind of other part of our self that's not the brain. Or is it part of the brain, the imagination? What would you say?
It's definitely part of the brain.
Okay.
In other words,
it has the ability or mechanism to create imagination.
Right. We can think of the brain as the hardware. So if you think of your computer, it has to have like a casing and where all the neurocircuitry goes, and then it has to have a screen. So the screen, when you turn on your computer, you get this screen with the different little files on it, right? We can think of that as this immediate memory that we have, the short-term memory, or like experiential memory, where it's an open kind of open file to where we can then work, right? Just like in your computer, you can open up certain files, read stuff, play videos, look at it, stuff you've done before, imagine stuff, right? All this you can do with your mind, because it's no accident that we design computers that way. We design them this way because that's how our mind works.
And so even when you think about artificial intelligence, it's basically using that same mechanism of imagination to piece things together and make assumptions, which is kind of odd.
Yeah. So going back to that idea, what is imagination? Is it just our ordinary thinking, or is it a special kind of thinking? So it depends how we define it, but the implications are, what we know from how the brain works is that we're imagining reality, or what we call reality, into existence. Again, if we just break it down into what is it that I'm seeing? Well, it's a mental process, or my brain is processing the information from light, from sound, from feel, sensory information.
But it feels like there's something external and solid, and it feels more real than we.
Yeah. So it's synthesizing all that information and creating the qualia, the experience, the first person experience of experiencing what we call reality.
Well, it's a really good example of this is if our human brain sees the world differently than a dog would perceive. So they said that if there's an orange on the table, the dog can't perceive that color. So for us, the orange looks rich and beautiful, but the dog sees an object that's gray and empty, like a vibrant color. And so it's just because maybe their brain didn't need to develop that need to have shiny, maybe because we have the things that we want to eat and the things that we don't, that it has a color to it and for survival, and maybe that's why we see the color orange. But it's that idea. So the fruit itself isn't orange. It's an object that we're perceiving orange from our own brain, because if it was really orange, then the dog would see the orange too. If there was an external objective reality. So basically that's what we're talking about, is what is the objective reality, and it's all imagination.
Right. In that perspective, there is no one objective reality, because it would depend on how your senses are interpreting that reality.
And we see the same thing. So a lot of people say, well, how can we all see the same thing? And how could it just be in our mind? It's because we have the same instrument.
Yeah.
Like I said, the dog will have a different experience of that orange than we will, but everyone sees that's human, that has a human brain, will have the same experience of that orange.
Absolutely.
But in it always a slightly unique way.
Right. So let's go deeper, because this is just the entry point into the senses.
Let's go deeper.
So deeper. What the implications are is that if we're creating our reality in our brain, right? If our brain is essentially making an interpretation of what we call real, that means it's a lot more malleable than we think. Now, the reason it doesn't feel malleable is because we're assuming that that we're perceiving an objective reality. So if you assume it's an objective reality, that if I see that orange and it's orange and that it's out there, then I can only perceive it that way. That creates kind of a very narrow an awareness, a limited awareness of what is out there, what is it that I'm experiencing. Whereas the imagination allows me to let's say to experiment, just like Einstein was, with my thoughts, with my perception, and shape it a little bit more. Open it up to different interpretations, to different possibilities, and that's what we call intelligence, essentially. It's the ability to observe something and perceive it in many different ways, instead of just the way we're taught or the way we're conditioned.
I like that. It's like we are initially taught how to see the world from our people around us, and then we have this capacity to expand our interpretation of what we're seeing and what's possible for us. But most people stay in that, taking kind of like they don't have that critical thinking where they just assume that these things are the way they are, and that's it. So imagination then is a way that we naturally use, but we're kind of using it by default versus using it in its ultimate potential, which a lot of people talk about potential, reaching your potential, and you're unlimited. And so that's really what we're getting at here. So let's talk about the idea of the mind now. So there's the brain and then there's the mind, which a lot of people think is the same thing, but it's not. My mind is this. No, it's not. You're in your head. The mind is a bigger concept. It's what we would call the conceptual mind. It's like we're kind of having this experience that arises from the brain of our individual identity and who we are, and then taking that input that the brain takes and then assigning it to, this is me and me having this experience. So it's a much bigger, isn't it just a computer program just intaking data? We're actually having a meaningful experience. This goes back to the mind-body problem in psychology. So the mind-body problem has been a problem in the West. It's not a problem for me.
Exactly. It's not really a problem, but it's a question because we can observe the brain. Mm-hmm. So if we, look inside a person's skull most of the time, or all of the time, we'll find the little
things that they put the caps and they measure like their responses.
Yeah, we'll find a brain there. We'll find a processing, doing
a
stuff.
Neuron kicking.
Yeah, they call it the wetware instead of the hardware of the nervous system, right? It's the central processing unit. But that's not the mind, right? Because we all know that the mind, we can't find it. If we look inside the skull, all we find is a brain. That's not the mind, because the mind is this experience that we're having of memories and sensations.
Remember, they studied Einstein's brain after he died, like they were going to find something special in it. Right?
Yeah. So in the West, it goes back to Descartes, this philosopher who said the mind is made out of a different substance than the brain. So the brain, we can see it, measure it, weigh it, its neurons, etc., doing different things. But the mind, he says, we can't see it anywhere, but we know it exists because I think, therefore I am, right? I can't deny that I'm thinking. Therefore, there's a mind there, but I can't find it.
Like, where is it?
Yes. So they definitely acknowledge there's a mind, which was a big breakthrough for the West. But they kind of see it as, or saw it as, something separate from the brain, and therefore when you go to a doctor, they look at you as a physical entity.
Like you have these symptoms, and they don't take apart the mind or your psychology or emotional, even emotions, right? Like your
that's somehow that's separate from what you are as a body, as a brain,
like a slab of meat,
right? And that's a weird notion, and if you think about it, everyone has bought into it. Most people operate on this assumption that our body is different than our brain. I mean, our mind, and that our mind, we know it exists because we're thinking, but
we can't really define it or understand it.
Yes, yeah.
We just don't, or some people just don't examine it. Some people don't even realize they're thinking. You know, they're existing, and they don't even noticing this thought that keeps pervasively running through their mind every day. Like, you know, it's interesting when you talk about the mind-body problem. One of the ways I saw this is it's like a perception of pain. When I first started out as a hypnotherapist, I did a lot of medical hypnotherapy, which is the clinical, working with people with surgeries. And one of the main things I did was childbirth. I was going to be the childbirth queen of hypnosis. And what they said was that there's contractions, and they go up and then they go down. And they said the perception is, as the contractions are going up, it's actually more painful for the person than when they're at the height, but it's going down. So this lower contraction as it's building is more painful, a perception of pain, than this one, which should have more pain because it's stressing the body. But the fact that it's decreasing, it doesn't feel as painful. So we have this kind of idea like, okay, so if the body has this ability to feel pain and defend ourselves, and then what is that mechanism that perceives the pain? And it's always, that's why they say 1 to 10, how do you feel? Because you can't even measure pain with people. So pain is a perception. And so that's why people can go through childbirth without pain. But there's this kind of idea that you have to, it's painful and it's terrible. Right. And, you know, the whole environment that they put people in the hospitals create more tension and more stress, which actually creates more pain. And so, so that, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but that's really what a good example of our mind and the physical body, and how they can have two different experiences, and the mind can actually create, like, the imagining that the pain's going away or that it's less, or imagining the pain is worse.
Exactly. Yeah, because at the end of the day, we are imagining our pain. Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean, like a lot of people think, well, if you're saying that I'm imagining it, that means that it's all in my mind, that it's not real then, that nullifies its validity. But that's not what we're saying. It's
not objective, it's subjective.
All we're saying is that the experience that you're having, the nature of that experience, the reality that you perceive in it and that you experience in it is your reality, that it's your subjective interpretation of it. And that means it exists, but the way it exists is not the way we used to think about it, or we assume it exists, right? We assume that it exists as an external objective reality, that somehow the meaning, the color, the sound, the experience is out there, or is verified by an out there, and that does not exist. The only way it exists is in our mind. That's the way it comes about. That's the way it's created.
Now, we don't want to discount the medical community, and there's a lot of research and understanding the physiology, biology, all that. Yeah. But we also want to say that a lot of the medical model, including therapy, is based on this idea that there doesn't take imagination into it. It's like a functioning, getting from dysfunction to functioning, getting from ill, and like almost seeing the person as ill. Like there's an illness that needs, mental illness, physical illness, that something needs to fix. And when you're impressing that onto someone, think about the imagination of the person that's receiving that treatment. They're going to say, oh, there's something broken in me and I have to fix. So when I worked with people with pain management and stuff, giving them the opportunity to explore using their imagination to imagine their body not feeling pain, imagine calmness, imagine floating, feeling, imagine disassociating from the physical stresses that are happening during childbirth and being in another place with your mind, so you're not focused on the what your body's doing, helps them. And so that's possible. What else is possible for people? Yeah. So let's talk about logic versus intuition, because would you say that intuition is really a form of imagination?
Absolutely. Again, it's all a form of imagination. In other words, we're
just imagining that we're living right now.
We're imagining our reality, right?
So there's nothing not of imagination.
Exactly. That's the only way reality exists. There is no other way it can exist except as a mental experience. In other words, if there's no mind to observe that reality, there is no reality, right? Because we're defining our reality through our sensory experiences, and our sensory experiences, if we just use logic, are essentially an interpretation, or they're giving us an interpretation of something that is there, but that it is an interpretation. It's not an absolute understanding of what is there. So yeah, intuition is definitely a form of imagination. And I think one way of seeing it is that, let's say, there are people that are experts at forgeries, for example. They know, when they look at a painting, they know intuitively if it's a fake or not.
You know that book Blink with Malcolm Gladwell? He talks about that there was this, it was a sculpture, and the person, I guess the museum person that was looking at whether, I forgot their name, the name of that person that assesses the value. He just said, I don't know what it is, but there's something about this that's off, and I can't figure out what it is. And he said, unconsciously, we have in our memory stored, not only personally, but collectively, as Jung would say, we have this storehouse of data that we are actually feeding into what we're seeing. And that intuition is like, it's not a logical, like practical way, it's just something off about it. And then it turned out the stone that they used for that sculpture was actually not made or not in that region. So it wasn't like a practical, like he recognized the stone, but when they examined it, but he knew something was off. And that's what intuition is. It's sometimes you don't know why, you don't have the story or the logic to back it, but you feel this knowing that's different. Like there's no knowing. So it's kind of like not based on logic, but on something beyond logic. Exactly. Is that how you would?
Well, we can think of let's say the way that person trained, right? So they probably looked at a lot of paintings in their lives and studied how colors are made and how they're laid on the canvas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all that information the brain is processing. Yeah. Now, as it looks at a new painting, let's say that the question is this real or fake? That brain, that mind is able to observe and just come up with a conclusion intuitively. Now, what that means is the other process is logical, or logic, right, or reason. So logically, if that person had only logic to go by, they would have to go through a process of elimination. Eliminating every possible solution,
deductive reasoning,
and question to, is this real or is this fake? And that would take a long time. But intuitively, they can jump to the conclusion if they trust their own mind and their own training, and reach the right conclusion intuitively without going through all the steps of logic.
So would that be combining logic and imagination?
It can be. And that's essentially the ideal, that we want to acknowledge the imagination and give it equal footing to logic and reason. Whereas in our culture, in our society, and the way we teach children now is very lopsided. It is left brain, logic, reason. Don't use your imagination. Don't use your intuition.
So is it kind of like that feminine masculine, like the logos and eros? The intuition is more the eros and the soulfulness of our soul versus the logic of...
Or the left and the right brain. The balance of the two is a very powerful combination. And when you see successful people, when you see creative people, when you see happy people, it's usually that they are able to combine and balance those two processes.
And we're happiest when we're kids, like just playing and imagining, and we're not when we're just trying to do the logical thing. And it's very, we want to bring that playfulness back in. So let's talk about this kind of idea of the fuzzy logic. And where does that come in?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm using it correctly, because it's a term from computers and information processing. But I love the term fuzzy logic because it's how we can use intuition in kind of in a more practical way. So instead of, let's say, we all know the process of problem solving. There's a new situation in our lives, something comes up, we need to decide what are we going to do with it.
And usually, let me write the pros, let me write the cons, let me make a practical assessment.
Yes.
Maybe run the numbers, right?
Exactly. If we apply everything we know now from the brain studies, the mind study, the consciousness studies, then we can use this combination of logic and intuition, this fuzzy logic, right? If we combine it, it's a fuzzy logic, meaning we're not denying that we need the logic, but we're also including the imagination. That there's a fuzziness to it. There's
like not as solid. Basically,
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of like
It's not as black or white. It's more a gray area.
There's more room to create in versus a hard logic.
Yes.
So when I think of imagination, one of the things that since we're always imagining, one thing we do know about the mind is that it has a negative bias.
Oh yeah.
So by default, we are always, it's always looking out for, number one, always looking for, is everything going to be okay? Am I going to be safe? Look out for danger. And that's a beautiful part of our mind, that logical, mind, but it uses that imagination to calculate wherever you go, like where are the dangers? And it's always taking it from the memory, correct? It's always like thinking, okay, last time I walked down a dark alley and I heard footsteps behind me, someone hurt me, or I saw it in a movie, so I'm going to get a reaction to that. So, or when we think about making a decision, I think this is where a lot of people trip themselves up and they stay in their conditioned safe zone is because by default the imagination will be negative because of the cognitive bias. The mind will start thinking of the worst case scenario versus the best case scenario. So when we're about to change our lives, and most people that listen to our podcast or watch it on YouTube will be wanting to change their life, and they rely on their mind to process that choice when they have an opportunity to do a program or to change careers or try something new or put themselves out there, meet new people, stretch their income, all those things that they want to do, find love. The imagination will tend to want to stop them because they're not really using it consciously. So by default, the mind will just go imagine, oh my God, if I go online, no one's going to like me, or it's going to be terrible, or if I start a new job or new career, the most terrible thing's going to happen. And so our imagination, if not trained or used, can actually create our reality in a very limited way. And most of the time what we imagine doesn't come true, thank God. But we can have an experience, like you said, it's all an experience of limitation in our life based on that imaginative mind. And then what we want to do is we want to basically start training our mind to think of that possibility. So we can use the imagination by default. The ego just says, watch out for danger and like all these scary monsters are ahead of you, or the imagination of hope and possibility and what's potential in me. Where can I go? What can be possible?
Yeah, I always think of the mind as this supercomputer, like a quantum computer, right? Because it does have imagination, not only logic. That's been delivered to our front door, but they didn't leave the
operating manual.
The manual for it, and so most people don't know what to do with this incredible mind that they're given. They use it basically to play ping pong or very simple games with it, and just kind of operate it
functionally.
The way it kind of naturally feels to them that. Okay, this is telling me
I gotta feed myself today,
right? How to survive?
Yeah,
and it's great, right? It's great for survival, but it has so much more potential and so much more ability. But it does require us to understand what is it that I'm working with, and to question it.
So, in other words, we all have a great imagination. It's how we use it that's the key.
Yes.
So we can imagine. Like Mark Twain said, a lot of terrible things happen in my life. My life was filled with terrible things. Most have never have happened, because the mind can create a hell or a heaven. It can create this terrible anticipation of a doom, or it can create this wonderful anticipation of adventure and creativity. But I think a lot of people don't realize that they can control that they can change and shift the flow of their mind, and it takes practice, because by default, like I said, it's that cognitive negative bias that we were born with. And a lot of people think, oh, I have negative thoughts. It's like, yeah, welcome to being a human. Everyone has negative thoughts. So it's about, what do you do with them? Are you going to let them run at your imagination and feed that imagination? What are you feeding that imagination with?
Yeah, then we come to the third level of it, which is the spiritual dimension of imagination. So in Eastern philosophy, then, we see a much more sophisticated understanding of what the mind and the brain are. They don't see it as these separate processes. They see both the brain, meaning the body, the physical body, arising within this pure awareness, like a pure awareness, meaning there are no thoughts, there are no emotions, there are no objects. It's a pure awareness,
like pure being, right?
That is the foundation of an absolute reality. So if you ask let's say a seer, we were able to teletransport a seer from ancient India to now and ask him or her, what is this universe made out of? They would say, it is made out of awareness, like a pure awareness that is primal. It predates human culture, human civilization, and it will be there after our civilizations are long gone. That primal awareness is what's called consciousness. So that primal awareness is
and
the
not
foundation.
consciousness meaning conscious mind, because a lot of people use that term as your consciousness meaning your conscious awareness.
Yes.
This is more the big awareness.
That's right. And so if we ask, okay, so where does the brain exist? It arises within that pure awareness. Where does the mind exist? It arises within that pure awareness. Where do the objects that I am perceiving of the world exist? They arise from that pure awareness.
Isn't there, well, they kind of describe it in a lovely way with Vishnu, is he has a dream. And it's like he goes to sleep and he has a dream and he dreams the world, and that is imagination. That's what creates this experience of duality and dance of life, and that's what imagination is like God or the universe or the pure awareness, whatever you want to label it, imagined the world into me. And so we have within us, all of us, that ability to imagine our reality, but we tend to just rely on that default condition programming, what everyone told us what is real, versus exploring the spiritual dimensions that are beyond just the practical survival mind.
Yes. And I think for, let's say if you ask, well, what is the function then of this incredible imagination that is given to each and every one of us? It is so that we can figure out what is the nature of reality and who am I? Who is the one that is experiencing these things called the world, and why?
You know, I think too, the imagination, when you're saying the who am I, is that we imagine who we are. We're imagining ourselves. We're in charge of what we want to imagine ourselves to be. Like we can imagine ourselves as this incredible person that's doing good in the world, or we can imagine ourselves as this loser who never accomplishes anything, or is always alone, or always struggling. Like we're always imagining ourselves, and we just don't realize that to reimagine who we are.
Yes, and that's an incredible property of the mind, brain, body, and awareness in us, that it's able to point the spotlight inward and ask, who is the one that is observing and experiencing all these things? That process is considered the inward journey, right? Instead of focusing only on the external objects and asking, what are these things made out of, and trying to figure out through physics, well, they're atoms and molecules and quarks and all these kind of physical things. We're asking inwardly, who is the one that is curious about the objects and is observing those objects and making meaning of those objects. That in the West, that study is only very recent. It's only recent, let's say in the past 20, 25 years, that people started really taking it seriously and asking, what is consciousness? What is that awareness? But now it's a bona fide study, and it's kind of giving us a new perspective on what are we going to do with this incredible brain and mind and imagination that's been given to us.
What's interesting is when I first started doing like hypnotherapy and self-help, and we all know, like, picture in your mind what you want to create and imagining objects out there being different. And it's a beautiful part. Like maybe that's like level one of, self-discovery. But then the next level is you have to ask yourself, who's the one asking for these objects or these experiences? That's the real journey. I mean, when you're manifesting in the world, it's like kind of child's play. It's like compared to when we're figuring out and trying to imagine like the depths of who we are on a deep spiritual level. So, but we could all begin somewhere. We all have this beautiful faculty in our experience to imagine. And so what would be something that people can do right now? Like, this is a lot of great information. What would you say is a really good step for people to start cultivating that imagination in a more creative way versus that limited, protective, I'm going to imagine the worst case so bad things don't happen to me. I want to imagine the best case so great things happen to me. I mean, you can go down either path.
Yeah. I was thinking about that this morning. We don't know a lot about the way the brain and the mind do their work. But the little that we know, just that much, if we were to apply it in our everyday life, would change the world. Just in the way we do education, for example, we understand that play is the imagination in action. So instead of having kids sit there all day and try to memorize things.
Well, right now they're in front of Zoom, or they have been with the headset on, watching a teacher and talking head.
The brain craves more that creative play, the ability to express itself and in a playful way. That feeds it more information and makes it more creative than any sitting there and paying attention process will do. So applying the principles that we know about how the mind and brain work would change everything. And the foundational, the biggest lesson that it teaches us is that we crave playfulness, right? And creativity.
It's something new. When I was a coach, well, I am still a coach, but in the coaching industry, I see a lot of like Me Too coaches, not in that other play, but, like carbon copies, they kind of have the same business model. They do the same kind of names. They teach the same stuff, just repackaged differently. And I feel like there's no imagination there. And I always felt like the odd one because we were doing Jungian work and we didn't really fit into that model, which is actually a blessing because that helped us stretch our imagination a little more and create something really special versus just another what everyone else is doing. And you look at in commerce, Tesla, the Tesla is an electric car, breaking the bounds. You want to bring something new into the world, be innovative. That's where the imagination can be used. So look at your life and say, what am I doing? Am I doing my career because it's what my parents said was rational, or because all my friends went to law school, so I became a lawyer? How can you bring more creativity and play into imagining something new? Imagine even what you do, even if you're a lawyer, doing it in a different way. Like your niece is so amazing. Like she's so cool what she does with her Instagram. She's a lawyer, but she does something very unique and creative. So how could you bring that into your life? How could you bring more creativity in your desires? And what you're going to find is that when you play, these insights come in that are just amazing, like you really are creating something unique and memorable that has a legacy that can be created.
Yeah, there was a book out a few years ago called The Coddling of the American Mind or something like that. But it's a psychologist who's talking about how we overprotect children now, and we don't allow them to make mistakes and to go through those difficult
everyone gets a
times.
Trophy.
Yeah, kind of everyone gets a trophy thing. And that's a great disservice to them because what we understand now about the brain is that it craves challenges and it grows from facing challenges, and even failing is better than not having those experiences. Failing at something teaches us sometimes more than succeeding at it. And now we're kind of anti-failure, right? We're trying to set up things to where kids don't fail, or we see kind of making mistakes as errors and something to avoid, whereas challenges are always about failing.
It stretches the bounds. Like whenever, anytime anyone in our life, you could look at your life, the biggest challenges led to the greatest change.
Yeah.
And the ego wants to avoid those terrible things that happen. And even after you make a mistake, your imagination goes back and tries to reimagine what happened, why did I do it wrong, and how can I fix the past, when we could be just being like, okay, well, here we are now, let's imagine the future. We spend so much time trying to go back in the past and reframe it and change it. And what if everything that happened led you here in this moment, because this is where you were meant to be, and then you move forward? I mean, it's like all we have is now. Like the past is gone, and you could move forward and become whoever you want to be.
Yeah, so
and the play, I think, is so important. Is that playfulness and that gentleness toward yourself, that you made mistakes and, you screwed up. You said the wrong thing to someone. They got mad at you. You know what? I'm sorry. I screwed up. You're honest and you play with it, and you bring that levity and you give permission for yourself to make mistakes and other people. And then the world is more gentle and compassionate if we're not always expecting each other to be perfect and to be, have a certain image. And we can be more creative. That's why I like hanging out with creative people, because they're willing to be different, right?
That's right. And so it's never too late. Wherever you are in your developmental process, you want to give yourself more challenges, more space to be playful, learn new things that are outside your comfort zone.
There's a comment here: the brain craves challenges, yet we are so afraid to face challenges, fears, and get out of your comfort zone. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if we crave challenges, but we crave change. And in order to have change, we have challenges. It's like alchemy, that you mix two, kind of opposing forces, and the mixture creates something new. And so you need to have that. It's almost like the universe is very violent in a way. If you look at how the earth was created and how everything new is created. I mean, even like I said, childbirth is not actually an easy thing to the body, so there's always that challenge. So instead of craving the challenge, we actually crave the change, but the challenge is the mechanism that creates the change.
Yeah, so if we only let's look at the brain. So there's two processes that are going on. One is that conceptual mind. So the conceptual mind helps us problem solve in a logical way.
Would you say that's like an ego?
Very much like what we call the ego. It helps us solve problems, stay safe, and create a comfort zone for ourselves. There's nothing wrong with that. That process is a natural process to keep us safe, to keep us in the familiar, so that we don't have to expand so much energy, because we know what to anticipate based on what we experienced in the past, right? And the brain loves that. It conserves energy by saying, I don't have to analyze everything that is going on in the situation, because I know I can predict what it's going to do.
And doesn't the brain kind of assess a situation, and it only focuses on things that are like an anomaly?
That's
so
right.
If someone's yelling, you're going to focus your attention there.
Yes.
Something is loud noise, or something that feels out of place, your brain is going to go toward that, but everything else is cool.
So that process is going on continuously. The other process that's going on continuously is that imagination, that craving for new things, new adventures, new sources of food, new ways of solving the problem. Now, those things are competing for attention. When we focus our attention to the problem-solving side, and we teach our children, or we're conditioned that way, that you should only focus on staying safe and fitting in and not rocking the boat, then that becomes our primary objective and our primary way of being, of using our brain, that we're so focused on staying in the status quo, not appearing to be different, fitting in.
But we're not even conscious of it a lot of times. We're kind of like, it's almost like we have this desire to change, but we don't know why. It almost feels like an invisible force. Is that
very much
what
so
you would think of it
Yeah,
as?
because it becomes, that's conditioning that we no longer question it. We simply assume that's what I should do. I should fit in. I should not appear to be doing something different.
It feels awkward if we step out. Right?
Yes.
There's like an alarm system goes off in us.
Yes. So creative people, successful people, we know they break the rules. They're often judged. They're often criticized. Why? Again, because they're breaking those bounds, those rules of conformity, of fitting in. They're saying, there are new ways to do this. There's possibility here. I can figure out something different. And that threatens that conceptual mind, right? That everyone, or that most people are operating from, of safety, security, predictability.
So we're always in that battle between the battle to stay the same and the battle to grow, but the friction between the two creates something new. Yeah. And we can't really, if we didn't have that resistance, we wouldn't be able to create something new, because the resistance basically kind of dredges up all the things that are in the way of us not having it by default anyway. It's like all the fears, and it makes us face the things that have held us back. So say you want to make more money, and you go out there and you're starting having like problems and hitting roadblocks. You examine those struggles and say, oh, well, this is why my income has been this way for the past 20 years, because of this one thing. And you can't see it without the friction, without stepping out. So, yeah, that's why it's like the challenges you want to go toward, and that's what's going to bring you something new.
Yeah. It is. It is always that internal battle that's going on. And
our friend, the appraiser, the real estate, actually, that's so interesting too. If you think about the imagination, that when you think about a home value, it really is a perception. Because that same home in a different neighborhood, or if the market's good or the market's bad, it changes the dynamic of what that value is. So there's no inherent value in that home except what our minds are holding. And it's the same thing with money. It's the same thing with the economy and all that stuff. So really interesting how the mind just creates our reality, and we imagine what we believe is there. So great topic today, Rob. We can either imagine the best case scenario, or we can imagine the worst case scenario. And by default, we look at the worst, but we can catch ourselves. And we can ask ourselves, what am I seeing? Am I seeing the truth? Is this just a thought, or is it really a fact? Do I know, is this a fact? Or is this just my imagination playing games with me of the worst case? Absolutely. And always just ask, what would be possible if it could be what I desire? What would that be?
Yeah.
I play the Debbie Gets Everything She Wants game. I know Rob is like, but it's like imagining I get what I want. Like in a situation, imagine it turning out the best for you. What would that be? What would that be? And that's really the first step. And play with that idea.
And we're going to continue our topics on mindset.
Yes, we have a lot of interesting topics to talk about. Perception, we're going to talk about neuroscience of perception, a little bit more of that. And keep going. So have a happy rest of your Friday. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Soul Sessions.
Thanks for watching.
Take care.